Good morning, and I hope everybody is well and your family and loved ones are healthy and safe during this time. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the People's Actions briefing on using deeper voter engagement in 2020 to help make meaning of this moment. I'm Joy Blackwood. I'm the Director of DC Strategy for People's Action. I manage our DC operations, federal policy, as well as bring the spirit and the priorities of our national network from the field into our nation's capital. As I mentioned, these are challenging times as we're all contending with today, given COVID-19. Today's briefing, which we would have loved to have done this in person, and we thank you very much for actually readjusting your schedules and being able to join us via video, is a very timely discussion. And with that, I'd like to introduce our director, George Gale of People's Action, who will now begin our program. George?
Thanks, Joy. Good to see you this morning. Appreciate everybody getting on the call. Yeah, I just wanted to further recognize the moment we're in. I think as change makers, we wake up looking to alleviate human suffering and also figure out how people can reach their highest human potential. And lives are always in the balance in that work, but never as many as right now. So it's just simply a lot to take in. As Joy said, we had hoped to do this briefing in person in DC about a month ago, but decided to move it online because of the pandemic. So today what we want to share is what we learned from a deep canvas experiment we conducted largely in the second half of 2019. The guiding question was, could deep, non-judgmental conversations at people's doors help shift how people think about immigration and immigrants in the US? I think many folks on the call know that coming out of the 2016 election, we decided to launch a significant rural organizing project. And we're really proud of that. We had major successes in building multiracial bases in rural and often very unorganized parts of the country and move people to action to win on issues. And yet we kept running into this situation. New members who are with us on healthcare, minimum wage, money and politics and more, folks that paid dues to the organization, proudly wore the organization t-shirt, but at the end of the day could just not get with us on immigration. And there's research by Lee Drutman of the New American Foundation that describes about 20% of the electorate is falling in this camp. So folks who are progressive on a set of economic issues, but anywhere from conflicted to regressive on immigration. And as we know, the right's going to continue to double down on anti-immigrant narratives to sow division and to consolidate power. We feel like we got to do more to address this conflict. And so today we're going to share what we did, what we learned, and what we think the applications are moving forward. And I'd say we think this work and work like it's going to be even more critical as the othering strategies of the right are going to shift and intensify in the coming months. We can see that very clearly in efforts to stir anti-Chinese and anti-China sentiment in relation to COVID-19. Before we fully jump in, I want to just recognize some of the people that made this project happen. The local organizations that anchored this work were Pennsylvania Stands Up, Michigan United, and Down Home North Carolina. Key partners were the Race Class Narrative Project, David Brockman and Josh Kalla, and the New Conversations Initiative. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ella Barrett of NCI. Ella?
Awesome. Thanks, George. Hi, everybody. Really happy to be here with you all this morning. At the New Conversation Initiative, we cultivate and train deep canvas programs around the country. And I was part of the team that developed deep canvassing as part of the LGBT movement. And we have spent the last 10 years adapting that work to new issues from climate change to jail reform. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what deep canvas is and why it is so important right now. So deep canvassing is a methodology that has been proven to fundamentally shift voters' perspective in a 10 to 15 minute conversation. And this is accomplished by a canvasser non-judgmentally eliciting a voter's view on an issue by asking follow-up questions about the voter's story. And then in return, as canvassers, we share our own personal stories about that issue. And the goal is to ground the voter in their real experiences instead of their hypothetical fears that we know are being stoked by opposition messaging. And deep canvassing has proven to have durable persuasion on a lot of different issues and has helped us win. So we won support for gay marriage in 2012 with a large-scale phone program in Minnesota. And just this last summer, we increased support for citizenship for undocumented immigrants and sanctuary city policies. We've also shown to increase support for access to abortion. And most recently, just this last month, we helped win a ballot measure in Los Angeles. We won the largest diversion of funding away from jails in US history. So why is deep canvassing different and why is it so effective? So in a long form type listening campaign, we are often trying to surface what pulls that voter towards us, what issues they care most about, what values we align on. And in a deep canvassing, we add this extra layer and the goal is a little different. Our goal is to surface conflicted feelings. We give voters a safe space to process their fears and contradictory beliefs. And let me tell y'all, like that is many. Like voters are so hungry for a space to process what they are feeling confused about and conflicted on. And what's powerful is that once we've surfaced those voters' real feelings and fears about an issue, then as canvassers, we can address that head on by sharing our own stories. And this process has been proven to inoculate those voters against future fear messaging and race baiting that we know is coming from right-wing movement. So why do we think deep canvassing is so important right now in this moment? In order to win in November, we need to mobilize and persuade many types of voters. We need to persuade and inoculate conflicted voters that's going to withstand that race baiting. We need to identify and inoculate our soft supporters and do that in a lasting way. We need to further understand and mobilize low propensity voters and folks who feel like they're being left out of the Democratic Party at this time. And the only way to do that is to mobilize a massive base of volunteers to have these kinds of conversations. And deep canvassing is a methodology that we believe can adapt to meet those needs in this moment. But our challenge is really clear right now. Like, how can we do deep canvassing and deep engagement when we're unclear of when we're going to be able to canvass again? So the exciting thing is that we have a great example of scaled deep electoral organizing, the Marriage Equality Campaign in Minnesota in 2012. And I'm going to actually pass it over to Ryan Greenwood, the Director of Movement Politics with People's Action, to talk about that.
Ryan, we can't hear you.
Hi, all. Thanks, Ella. I'm here to tell you that you can scale deep canvas operations. You can do it with volunteers, and you can do it on the phones to be safe in the era of COVID-19. And that people on this call have done it to the biggest scale in the last decade. The reason this is important is we need to take this methodology to scale to move hundreds of thousands of people because we need it to win elections in the fall. We also need to adapt it to the COVID-19 moment where door knocking isn't happening, but also where tens of millions of Americans are in a public health and economic crisis that's dismantling their lives, and they're looking for the reason why. We know about moving people on immigration, and as anti-Asian Pacific Islander racism rises, we need this methodology to combat that. The good news is we have the experience taking deep canvassing to scale and using phones to make it happen. The case study I'll talk about is the Minnesota gay marriage campaign in 2012. I was the deputy campaign manager for that campaign and ran the organizing outfit. Other folks on the People's Action National staff team had leadership roles in the organizing, like Laura Wales, Steve and Ella from the New Conversation Initiative, along with others at the Leadership Lab then in Los Angeles. Dave Fleischer and Regina Clemente developed deep canvassing and brought it and were part of the lead operation in Minnesota on that ballot initiative. In 2012, in the backstory is that an anti-marriage constitutional amendment was placed on the ballot. We knew that the movement had lost 30 straight times, had never sustained a victory against an anti-marriage amendment or ballot initiative. And so we started 10 points down in the polls. We knew we needed to engage hundreds of thousands of Minnesotans. We built the largest scaled volunteer-driven deep canvass effort in history. We hit over 33,000 direct voter contact volunteer shifts. As you see from the slide, a little over 13,000 of those were during the persuasion period of the campaign. We had over 500,000 tracked conversations with voters, about 200,000 in that persuasion period. And we tracked in follow-up movement of about 20,000 people. So we were moving about 10% of voters on the issue through our electoral work. We think from that experience that deep canvassing is a massive movement building opportunity. We moved tens of thousands of people, more people to our side on an issue, but also built a massive volunteer base for sort of permanent organizing in the state. That was the volunteer base that then enacted a pro-marriage law in the subsequent legislative session. We also, in the course of that, did see significant base mobilization, because not every door did we know that the person was conflicted. We hit some doors where there were strong supporters and used the deep canvass methodology to ground them in their personal story if they were cynical about voting, to motivate them to vote. This methodology, while sort of best implemented on the doors, does work on the phones. Our experience is that people are willing to ask intimate questions and share intimate details of their lives over the phones. You need an extremely rich volunteer support operation to make that happen: coaches, trainers, debriefers, somebody to track and support everyone so that we have repeat volunteers and long-term canvassers, and we maintain a resilient operation. We've already moved our deep canvass operation this cycle over to the phones in Wisconsin in the wake of COVID-19. We've done about 7,000 calls in the last week, contact rate of about 10%, and with a full conversation rate with that 10 to 15 minute conversation of about half those contacts. So we're, we believe it will be successful nationwide. In addition to that, I think we're positioned to build a scaled volunteer operation with so much energy around the Sanders campaign, who we endorsed. We're positioned to capture that even as that race transitions and Vice President Biden becomes the likely nominee. I'm going to pause here for questions on either my presentation or Ella's section defining deep canvassing before we introduce David Brockman from the UC Berkeley to talk about our initial results. Any initial questions? All right, I'll pass it over to Professor Brockman to talk about the results of our first round experimentation.
Thanks so much. So David Brockman at UC Berkeley here. I'm an associate professor in the political science department. What I'm going to present today is the results of a clinical trial we did with People's Action to measure the effects of this deep canvass program. Later on in the webinar, you're going to hear more about what this looked like on the ground. You're going to see what the script was. But to motivate some of that, I'm going to show you some evidence that we think is pretty strong that this program actually did work. And so it's really worth learning about. And I'm just going to give you the kind of top line findings, and then I'm sure you guys will have lots of questions. Great. So what we did was a field experiment or a clinical trial to measure persuasion. The way this worked, we started by asking lots of people in the areas where these 3 member groups were organizing to try to join a survey. We sent them a letter asking them, please join. I was at Stanford at the time, the Stanford and Yale Opinion Survey. This is a joint project with my collaborator, Josh Calla at Yale. Then we had a number of people, just under 9,000, join this online survey, had tons of questions that had nothing to do with immigration or healthcare. The idea was that people taking this survey wouldn't realize that the purpose of this survey was to measure canvassing, but had tons of questions about other issues, doesn't mention canvassing at all, and a few questions in there that give us a sense of people's baseline attitudes before the program started. Then we take these people and randomly assign them to one of three groups. Two of those groups were randomly assigned to get the Deep Canvas script in two slightly different forms, or to a control group or a placebo group. This is just like in a clinical trial in medicine, where you would take patients into a hospital, randomly assign them to, say, blood pressure medicine or a sugar pill, and then on the back end measure their blood pressure to see if the blood pressure medicine works. In this case, we're taking voters and we're randomly assigning them to get a knock on the door and then give them a conversation or have a conversation with them using the Deep Canvas approach. Or they do the survey, we knock on the door. We could have done the Deep Canvas just like we could have given patients a blood pressure medicine, but here our sugar pill is just a short, unrelated conversation. So we know the kind of person who we could have given the treatment to, but didn't, because they were randomly assigned. Then we take all of those people and we, now we're back to the world of the survey. We take those people who are reached at the door, either with the Deep Canvas or with the placebo, and we send them a follow-up email that says, hey, we have another set of questions for you. Again, lots of questions having nothing to do with immigration or healthcare, but a few that do. And then we look to see 1 week later. So if you say got canvassed on, if you got canvassed today, then say on April 1st, a week from today, we would send you an email said, hey, we have these follow-up questions for you. We look at people's answers to the immigration questions. We also do two further follow-up waves, because very often in politics and political persuasion, we see that things like TV ads or mail or whatever else might have some small persuasive effect initially, but those effects often decay as people just return to their pre-existing baseline. So a really important finding of some prior programs, we wanted to check to see if it was true here, is does any persuasion that happens initially, does that actually stick? Because we want to be building the people that stay with us for the long term, not just 1 week later. So there's another follow-up survey we did 7 weeks later, and then a final follow-up survey we just wrapped up that was done on average 4.5 months after the canvassing took place. We can look at the initial and also the long-term impact. Getting now to the implementation details. I'm glad to answer more questions about this, but just to give you a broad overview, the voters were relatively representative of these areas. Around half were white, around half were people of color. They leaned in the slightly more conservative direction. Conservative was the most common ideological identification of these voters. And sort of like the country at large, you see that these voters, just under half of them approve of Donald Trump. And I'll show you some results split out by people's kind of partisan leanings later on. The canvassers, likewise, are about 44% people of color, about 16% of them are immigrants, and about 56% of them are white. None of the results seem to really differ that much based on the identity of the canvassers. So we just, in the results I'm going to show you, we just kind of pull everyone together. And as Ella was saying, these are relatively lengthy conversations. The median length of the conversation, the Deep Canvas conversations, was 15 minutes. So we're going to show you more in a little bit. How could you possibly spend 15 minutes having a conversation? We'll show you more, but just to give you a sense that these kinds of results, you don't get from just a quick 1 minute reading the script. And last, if we look in that baseline survey we did prior to the conversations, it was only around 21% of people that supported including undocumented immigrants in universal healthcare. So as George said, this is an issue that we know the right is using to divide the base, and we see that in this case, that even a lot of the voters who otherwise look like members of the progressive base don't agree with this particular policy. Great. So what do the results look like? So here what we're going to do is, I'm using this clinical trial, we're going to look at the people who we reached at the door and either had the Deep Canvas conversation with or didn't, and then how they responded to those follow-up surveys. When we look at the first follow-up survey, this was done 1 week after the canvassing. We had 3 different questions, all meant to ask using different language. Do you think that undocumented immigrants should be covered in universal health care? Should they be covered in Medicaid in your state, et cetera? What we find across all 3 of those different ways of asking the questions that it's around, for every 100 conversations that are completed, it's about 8 new supporters. So if a canvasser spent a week having 100 conversations, 8 of those conversations would have led someone who otherwise opposed the policy to support it. That's just a really large effect. We also see when we look at the at the follow-up survey that was done several weeks after that, we see effects, and likewise when we go 4.5 months later, those effects seem to be sticking. That effect seems to persist, that even 4.5 months later, the people that were talked to, at this point, we're talking about back in, like October or November, even to this day, are significantly more supportive. So that 8 percentage point effect, how big is that? I think it can be hard to contextualize, is 8 percentage points big or is it small? From where I'm sitting, I think when I first saw that result, I was kind of floored. That is larger than the shift away from Democrats in Michigan from 2012 to 2016. That's around 6 years of change on attitudes towards gay marriage. So if you think about public opinion on that issue in, say, 2006 versus 2012, and it's larger than the effects of social pressure on voter turnout in a very quiet election. So those are all very different contexts, but just to give you a sense of, is 8 percentage points big? In the context of politics, I would say it's one of the largest effects that I've ever seen in a randomized controlled trial. So really, really impressive. Just to give you a sense, we have a lot more results that we can dig into, but just one other headline result. If we split out the data by the voters who started approving or disapproving of Donald Trump at baseline, the most important thing I would note here is that we see effects for both. So this isn't just a matter of taking the people who are already in the progressive base and then kind of preaching to the choir. We see that this does really effectively inoculate the progressive base and bring them into supporting these policies. But even the people who start off more conservative, who say that they approve of Donald Trump at baseline, are moving significantly. And then last, there's a lot of other questions we asked on the survey that weren't narrowly just about healthcare, because as Ella said, these are not the kinds of canvases where you just give people kind of a narrow talking point on a particular policy. The idea is to try to shift a broader worldview, and we see several indications of that in the data. We see changes on other policies. We also see on this slide, we show that when we ask these questions about people's views towards immigrants, not specific to policy, but broadly, questions such as, do you think undocumented immigrants hold the same values as you and your family? Or do you see them as a burden on your community? We see shifts that are pretty consequential that last as well on these kinds of worldview questions. Last, although this was a C3 program, we didn't go in intending to try to change anyone's views towards Donald Trump. As I mentioned, we had all these other questions on the survey that were intended to just be filler questions that we didn't really think would move and are just there to disguise the purpose of what we're up to. And so one of the questions we asked was how people plan to vote in the 2020 presidential election, as well as whether they approved of Donald Trump's performance. After we saw just how big the effects were on the main policies we were interested in and on these worldview questions, we said, wow, I wonder if this even might have affected people's views on Donald Trump. And we actually found some evidence that it did. Now, this is kind of borderline statistically significant, so these results are not as super crystal clear as the others, but there is some suggestive evidence here that this actually spilled over to how people are thinking about Donald Trump, that we're seeing effects 1 week later, 7 weeks later, even 4.5 months later, that there's decreases in Trump approval, and even in some instances, decrease in intention to vote for Trump, even though that was not really the goal of this program, and Trump was never really talked about in part of the conversations. Just shows you the power of these conversations. Great, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to others to talk about this program that was so effective. What did it actually look like? How did they get this done? Actually, I guess first, I think, I should pause actually first for questions. Does anyone have questions about, you're gonna hear much more about what the script looked like. Are there questions just about the results, the technical aspect, the clinical trial? When were the surveys done? So this was all towards, so the final follow-up survey, the 4.5 month survey, we just did like two to 3 weeks ago, I want to say. And then I can get you the exact dates for the other surveys, but basically it was contemporaneous with the canvassing. So whenever the Canvas folks will probably know the exact Canvas dates, but essentially because the canvassing takes place over a series of a few weeks, whenever someone is contacted at the door, we follow up with them 1 week later. So the follow-up survey, everyone's getting the survey on a different day depending on when they're canvassed, but this program was done basically towards the end of last year. Yeah, so the 1 week follow-up surveys on a rolling basis because not all the canvasses are done on the same day. So say that one person is canvassed November 1st, they're going to get their follow-up survey on November 8th. If someone else is canvassed on October 1st, then they're going to get their follow-up survey on October 8th. So everyone gets their follow-up survey on the schedule depending on when they were canvassed. So there's a question about how we can apply this when we connect to door-to-door. I think the other panelists might have more to say about that at the end. As we start looking forward, I'll just briefly mention. Oh, sorry. So I think you guys might not be able to see the questions. There was a question about whether this would work door-to-door. So we'll talk more about that at the end, I think, but just I'll say from the results point of view, although phones were not part of this particular program, we have in the past done experiments on kind of deep canvas phone programs where you find sort of as we were hearing earlier, sometimes the contact rates are a little lower, but we see pretty strong effects from those as well. So you stated that there didn't seem to be a difference in results-based identity of the canvasser. Can you elaborate a little more on how that conclusion was made? Sure. So the way that this worked, so basically canvassers are essentially partly randomly assigned to doors. So we basically have a kind of another layer of the RCT going on where which canvasser every voter is getting is also a product of a random assignment. And so then what we can do on the back end is when we get the data from the groups on, so this person came to the door, this voter came to this canvasser was there, they had a conversation this long. In that data that we get, we know which canvasser contacted each voter, and we have data on those canvassers' background. And so what we can do on the back end is say, let's look, just at the canvassers who identified as immigrants, or just at the canvassers of color, or just at the white canvassers. And say if we just restrict the data there, compare, say, the people who opened the door and had the deep canvas conversation with canvassers who are immigrants versus people who opened the door and had the placebo conversation with the canvassers who are immigrants. We can do that apples to comparison just for the people who were reached at the door for canvassers with different identities. And we find that, broadly speaking, the results are pretty similar, which is something that we've tended to see in the past as well, that canvassers of lots of different backgrounds can be effective with these kinds of programs. See if there's other questions.
So there's one, hey, this is Ryan Greenwood from the People's Action Political Team. Just in response to the question on phones, would defer to Professor Brockman about, the specific research studies that were done. We did, in the course of the Minnesota Marriage Campaign, about 200,000 conversations were done by phone with voters. We did a follow-up round of contact to re-ID people and found movement of about 20,000 of them. And we can share with folks, we plotted out their movement rates by voter after the election as well. And so it was not the same level of kind of thorough social science survey we're talking about here, but given the scale, we did see impact in the ability to move voters on the phone to, in that case, a rate of about 10%.
Great. I know there's going to be a longer Q&A at the end. Should we transition on to hearing about what this program actually looked like?
I think we had one quick question about training. How long does the training of a canvasser take? Are you recording any of the Canvas conversations so you can learn how the interaction goes. So Canvas training, we really encourage folks to get out on the doors in their first training. So we train for about 2 hours. We go through the fundamental skills of a deep canvas. We role play, we help folks develop their stories, and then we go out and do it. And I would say a lot of the training is actually done in the debrief process. We've found it's really critical and important to have a long debrief for folks to share what went really well, but also how it didn't go well. Holding that emotional space for canvassers is really important because there is some emotional labor, and we do subsequent trainings from then, and have sort of developed an order of skills and a curriculum in which we put canvassers through to further develop their skills as they move on in canvassing. And we have done a lot of videotaping conversations because we've found for the script development process, figuring out what is working, but also coaching, video has been really helpful. I will.
Okay, I guess that's my cue. Hello, everybody, and I just want to say I'm very excited to be here with you, to be sharing this long version of the script we did on the doors. My name is Sugalema Lynch, or Shug for brevity and less confusion. I am a community organizer for Down Home, North Carolina. Before I became a community organizer, I was also a second grade teacher. Just a bit of background, before getting involved with Down Home, honestly, I never paid much attention to the political world. I was in the mindset that the government doesn't work for people like me. In fact, prior to becoming an organizer at Down Home, I had only voted twice in my lifetime. Once was the 2016 primary election, and the other was when I was living in California. Arnold Schwarzenegger was running for governor. Politically, I would describe myself as a persuadable, and I feel like this made this project perfect for me. Right now, I live in Alamance County, which is one of the major arteries of white supremacy in the nation. On top of that, we also have one of the most racist sheriffs in the nation patrolling our communities. I came into this work after getting many phone calls from my undocumented families telling me that they were afraid to send their kids to school. They were afraid to go to work, to go to the store. They were just afraid to leave the house. They were afraid because their communities were under constant surveillance, not only by the sheriff department, but also ICE. And to be honest, they're still afraid. They're still under surveillance. There are regular ICE raids and driver's license checkpoints in our communities that are tearing our families apart. I felt like I had to do more. And as the saying goes, ask and you shall receive. Out of nowhere, I found myself right in the middle of this project. When I started this work, I had zero experience canvassing. I didn't know what I was getting myself into, but curiosity got the best of me and I jumped on board. And I wasn't really sure this idea was going to work. The script was long. I thought to myself, how could I possibly hold the attention of a complete stranger long enough to get through it, not to mention holding a conversation about two of the most controversial topics, universal healthcare and immigration. And would I ever get past the feeling of knocking on a stranger's door to even have a conversation? So with the first slide, with that said, I'm gonna do my best to walk you through the progression of the long script we used at the doors. The initial part of the script consisted of a friendly and a brief introduction. We confirmed that we were speaking to the correct voter. Without hesitation, we dove right into the first question, collected a rating, and asked the voter to share why that was the right number for them. As they answered, we provided a non-judgmental tone and never interrupted as they spoke, and we would finish by saying, thank you for sharing that. The next question we asked was in regards to including undocumented immigrants in a universal healthcare plan. Again, we collected their rating using the same scale as before and asking why that was the right number for them. If the voter was undecided, we would probe by asking what was on either side of that issue for you. Again, our tone remained neutral and we thanked the voter. And I want to add that as we were listening to these initial responses for these two questions, we were also making mental notes. In a sense, we were gathering a bit of information that we could potentially use later on in the next part of the script. Once our baselines were collected, our conversation shifted into an intentional connection with the voter. Typically, I would transition by saying, I'm a 10 on both scales because these issues are personal to me, but I'm out here today because I think it's important to try to have open and honest conversations with each other at a time when our country feels so divided. Right after that, the next question was, do you know anybody who's moved to the US? And as before, this part required non-judgmental listening, topped with a giant scoop of empathy, curiosity, and space. If you look at the slide, you'll see the cone of curiosity, and this was the method that we learned we learned to dig deeper into a story by asking the right questions at the right time, especially if somebody couldn't think of a story. As a canvasser, we had to listen closely so that we could hear a hint of a story and know that that was the right time to dig in. As we often heard by our trainers, it was better to dig 1 6-foot hole than 6 1-foot holes. As we listened, we would look for opportunities to ask questions, evoke emotion, details. How did that make you feel? Why did you think or feel that way? What did you do? What was the person's name? Tell me more. To my surprise, strangers really like to share. Then I would share my personal immigration story. After our immigration stories, transitioned into sharing struggle stories. Just like with the immigration story, we would ask questions to activate a personal story. The goal was to continue connecting on a personal level and getting voters to think about the different ways we, as people, regardless of our immigration status, all fall upon hard times and need help. Again, while we listened, we used the cone of curiosity to ask deeper questions, evoke emotion, and activate the voters' values. At this point, the voter and the canvasser, we have built rapport. We knew more about each other and we had formed a bond. Now we would move into the race-class narrative, which of course was pioneered by the amazing Anat Shankar-Osorio. Just had to shout that out. And this was a pivotal moment in the script because the tone of the conversation shifted to a reflective moment. It was an opportunity to step back and relay a message of humanity and a bigger we. We deserve more. Personally, this is the part in the script that always felt like a good point to exhale and step back. There can be a lot of tension getting through the script sometimes, but this was the part where we could come together. It was the moment to reflect on the fact that we, just as a human collective on this planet, are all doing our best to create a life of dignity and safety for our families. And if we get to know each other, we can start to see similarities. We can start to see our similarities and embrace our differences. And that's where we can actually create a government that works for all people: immigrants, Black people, brown people, poor people, all classes of people, and not just the billionaire class. Finally, the last part of the script was used as a processing moment for the voter. We would help the voter describe the cognitive dissonance they were experiencing. I remember times when I could physically see a voter struggling to make sense of their conflicting thoughts as their values were being challenged by the ideas they perhaps heard on the news. We would end the conversation with a final rating and an incredible amount of appreciation and gratitude for the time the voter had spent speaking with us. As canvassers, we really did make long-lasting connections with strangers on their front doors, to my surprise. The things I appreciated the most about this script would be giving people the space to share their stories. Like Ella said, people want to share their stories. And developing an emotional connection through the act of non-judgmental listening. Empathy was key, and having people come to their own conclusions by asking the right questions was extremely powerful. After having all these conversations, I feel confident that using this type of script as a way to move voters and help them connect with their values, it will help them connect with the values they truly hold in their heart. And to be honest, like, I can't tell you how many times voters would say, thank you so much for what you're doing, even if we didn't always agree. And just to wrap it up, on a personal level, this experience changed my point of view. You know, I went from believing that politics didn't matter to feeling like as one little human on this planet, I could actually change the one conversation at a time. And if there are any questions, I would be happy to answer them. And if not, I would like to introduce Dom Holmes from Stands Up.
Hey, thank you, Shug. I hope that you all can hear me. Um, I think that I'm having a little bit of problem with video right now, but I'm just gonna go through this anyway. So my name's Dom from Pennsylvania Stands Up. I'm an organizer of PA Stands Up, very gratefully. And I just want to share some of my experience as someone who actually was on the doors, similar to Shug. Um, I really just wanted to highlight some of that experience and bring that all together to illustrate that. So one of the key things I wanted to start off by sharing is that going into this, I had so many doubts. I just didn't know that, what I was getting myself into would be something that turned out to be so successful. I didn't know if I really believed in it. And, it all started in a training where I had, Ella and Steve and Adam telling me all these great things about how if you talk to people about their feelings, that you can move them. And I just wasn't really sold on that. I wasn't sure that talking to people about, what their ideology is and how they arrived at that ideology could be successful. I really didn't know if that could work. And I had doubts that as a 6'5" younger Black man going into rural Pennsylvania, talking to people about their political ideology, that this could be successful. I didn't know if, that would be something that could work for me. And much to what David Brockman said, it ended up being very successful. Actually, it was a surprise to me because I didn't expect it. I didn't know if I believed in it, but it worked, and I saw it immediately. From that first day going out on the doors, we went to the neighborhoods that had Confederate flags, and it made me feel extremely vulnerable and extremely uncomfortable to be talking to these people who I didn't think were to me. But they ended up actually being receptive to what I was saying. And one of the stories I think highlights and illustrates that is a day out canvassing, deep canvassing, in Dover, Pennsylvania, which is as rural as it gets. We're in a trailer park, going door to door, and I knock at this door that has a no soliciting sticker posted on the door. And this is just a quick aside, but the no soliciting stickers were pretty much a telltale sign that whoever is at that house was most likely not going to be willing to have a conversation with us. They probably weren't going to be open to discussing politics with us. I mean, and very true to what what our experience was with that. The guy who answered the door was very hostile, very unwelcoming, just not looking to have a conversation with us. He comes out, can you read? Can't you see that it says no soliciting? And from the experience of having to deal with that so much, I kind of calmed him down and just kind of made him clear that I just was there to talk to him. I wasn't there to throw any statistics or polls at him or tell him that he's wrong and I'm right. Which maybe might have been my approach before learning about deep canvassing. I thought that if I share these statistics and these polls with people, they just didn't know. They were just ignorant of the truth. And once they see it, that they'll come to the enlightened side of the world. But that just doesn't work. That draws people further into their little corners. And so by going through that conversation and just showing him the vulnerability of that and just showing him that I cared to hear how he felt about this issue, I truly wanted to understand. I wanted to unpack through that cone of curiosity what all of this meant to him. He had a level of trust with me because I was just there to listen. I wasn't there to tell him he was wrong. I wasn't there to show him that a statistic from Yale or Harvard or whatever reveals that his ideology is insufficient. That is something that I think built that trust for him to open up. He wouldn't answer the questions initially. How Shook just went through the script and showed that first question goes right into it. On a scale of 0 to 10, 1 to 10, 0 to 10, how do you feel about this? He refused to even answer that until he got a good understanding and that good basic level of trust built with me. And once he built that level of trust with me, he actually circled back in order to answer the question. And that would have never happened. I would have never formed that connection with him had he not built that trust with me and not had that human to human connection that we built. And by me being mutually vulnerable with him, me opening up to tell him how I felt, but not using it to cast any type of shame on him or to to correct him, it was essential to the conversation. And I think that goes back to the roots of organizing in itself in a lot of ways. That human to human connection is the basis of anything. You can't get people to take your hand and lead them into anything or believe in you in any way unless you build that connection. And that's something that has really changed, a lot of what my approach is since then. That has changed a lot of how I have approached organizing in the time since. And I think that it's so meaningful that someone who's 6'5", Black male, who's liberal leaning, to go into a trailer park with a bunch of conservative people that are flying Confederate flags and have a conversation where by the end we are on the same page, at least that we think that certain things are human rights, or we're at least able to have a civil conversation. And that's the biggest part of it. We wouldn't be able to have that conversation otherwise. And I just wanted to close it out by stating that unpacking all of this and sending people into all these environments is so emotionally demanding and draining. To send a young Black man into a trailer park where there's Confederate flags everywhere, people who don't look like they want him there, is extremely demanding and emotionally draining. So there has to be emotional support from leadership. It has to exist, and that's something that was built into the project that I was a part of previously. And just going forward, it has to be something that is included as a means of support for the team. It's the only way that it can be feasible to continue forward. But I appreciate you all for having me. I hope you're all doing well. I'm getting a little bit of cabin fever myself, but hang in there. I hope we'll get through this. And I'm going to hand it off to Murdad at People's Action.
Adam, are you jumping in?
Oh, yeah, I can jump in if you want me to start. Just there's a question in the chat, and the question was basically like a little bit about like what was the contact goal, like how big were these Canvas teams, what was the contact goal for each Canvas shift, and then really what's the cost per conversation. And so really briefly, there was about each state had between a Canvas team that was about between 12 to 15 canvassers. So we had about 35 canvassers across the 3 states that were participating in the program, and canvassers averaged 3.5 conversations per shift. And so one thing to just name is that because of the design of the experiment, our density was much lower. So it was very, it was difficult. Sometimes people would have to drive in between homes. So the contact rate and the cost per conversation is skewed a little bit because of the design of the experiment. But we're building, really scaling this up in a massive way right now in the spring and again in the fall. And our estimates are it's about between $17. It's about a little between $17.80 and between $17.80 and almost or $18 per conversation. And we think it's slightly more expensive than the traditional door-to-door canvas, but we think it's just so much more impactful than, so the really in terms of the cost per persuasion or the cost per actual vote is much lower than a traditional canvas, just because the quality of the interactions are so much lower. But just wanted to, that was a question that I think Kenny had asked in the chat.
Great. All right, so we're gonna talk about basically what we've learned so far from all these experiences and what we're doing with them right now and what we plan to do. My name is Murdad Azaman. I'm the Senior Strategist for People's Action, and I'm gonna lay out 2 groundbreaking initiatives that, that we're building based on the learnings, the massive learnings that we had last fall. And after we hear from Maria Elena from Michigan United, our political director, Ryan Greenwood, he's going to basically put those initiatives inside the context of our bigger updated political plan. So first, we're very excited to be partnering with the Immigration Hub, and they've built a pretty amazing digital operation in Michigan and in Pennsylvania. With big audiences, and specifically they've done some testing around immigration, and we're going to hear from Tyler Moran later on this call, their principal. And we are excited to be basically layering a deep canvas approach on top of those series of digital tactics the Immigration Hub will be doing to see if we can move voters on immigration in those two states, Michigan and Pennsylvania. On another front, we're really so overwhelmed by the results of the experiment last fall and the impact that it specifically had on Trump, despite the fact that we never even said his name, that we wanted to take this another step further and really test the impact of developing an anti-Trump deep canvas experiment. And we wondered, could we move people in an anti-Trump context? There's never been a C4 political deep canvas experiment. Obviously holds massive implications for all of us on this call, for our allies in the wider movement. There are 6 states participating. You can see them on the screen there across the country. And we've begun script iteration, working from the learnings from last fall to have a compelling field persuasion program. We've obviously moved everything to the phones, and we've got weekly national calls where all the states call in. We're debriefing that script 3 to 4 times a week and conducting an experiment. And obviously, we're doing this phones only. We are we're launching into measurement in mid-May, and we're going to talk with about 3,000 people, similar to the scale that we did for the experiment last fall. We will have results at the end of June and want to share the results, the findings widely in July. And we've got a number of people, a bunch of people who are on this call from SEIU, AFL-CIO, Democracy Alliance, and we thank you for joining the advisory committee that we formed for that. And then, as I said, we've started iteration already. And I'm sure there'll be questions about the status of the experiment as it stands, but we wanted to make sure folks heard directly from what it's been like so far to be on the phones and talking with voters on this script. And I have, and so we've asked Maria Elena Fournier from Michigan United to speak about that. Maria Elena?
Hello, my name is Maria Elena. I'm a deep canvasser and organizer with Michigan United. A little about myself. I'm originally from Puerto Rico. I'm a child of a Puerto Boricua and German immigrants who passed away due to a lack of healthcare and resources within their communities. My twin brothers and I also have pre-existing conditions, and it's been very difficult getting access to appropriate care. And I also live with my fiance's mother, who is an immigrant from Colombia. She has been facing constant pushback from the government, immigration, and conservative-leaning people in our area just for her having an accent. I initially became interested in this project because of the rise of the alt-right movement and perpetual inequality our communities are experiencing, especially now with the Trump presidency. Our current C4 script focuses primarily on the 2020 presidential election. Initially, we start off our conversations by asking how the voters are doing and establishing an emotional connection with voters pertaining to the current coronavirus crisis. When we ask them on their rating of Donald Trump and then of a Democratic candidate. From there, we proceed to ask them about what issues impact them or matter to them the most, so we can gauge what issues we should focus on with that particular voter. This step also helps us understand what the most prevalent issues are that we need to focus on for this election year. Through these particular issues, we share our stories and use the cone of curiosity to express solidarity, which truly helps in moving the voter. These shared stories really impact me because it truly showed how we all go through the same struggles and how we're all being taken advantage of by the broken system. And through these conversations, the voters themselves are realizing it as well. And I realized that these conversations strengthen our race-class solidarity. It shows me how important it is for us to advocate for one another and to make sure all our voices are heard so that no one has to suffer with what any of us or any of the voters have had to ever go through. It is extremely crucial that we have these conversations with these voters because the majority don't know what to do or what to think about these particular issues, especially with this current crisis we have going on. And interesting things we've seen so far are that a lot of voters, the moment you mention the word president, they completely want to remove themselves from the conversation, or they feel a bit turned off by this election, or they're extremely stressed out about this election. And these are the voters that we want to engage and that we must engage through deep canvassing because they're more likely with us or soon to be on the same page. And there are also voters that seem to be on the exact opposite extreme that we found so far that express surprising approval for the way Trump's handling the coronavirus crisis. And thankfully, when we start off our conversations asking about how the voter themselves are doing with this coronavirus crisis, it really seems to engage the voter and keep them talking with us over the phone. And it's because we're explicitly showing that we care about their well-being. And so far, we've had 3 iteration periods, and we've had already 44 conversations. So we've only had 3 shifts, and we've already had 44 conversations, and we're having a great turnout. Most people do want to talk, and they want their voices to be heard. In Michigan alone, during the 2020 presidential election, Trump only won by an extremely small margin of about 0.2%, which was about 10,000 voters. And last year, during the other script that we did, we were able to knock on hundreds of doors, and it made a clear impact with almost everyone we spoke to on any side of the political spectrum. And I chose this work to become part of the movement that changes our system to represent the people and not the 1%. All of us involved in this movement with deep canvassing and mutual aid are going to be part of the catalyst that turned the tide this fall during the election season. And thanks for listening to me. I'm going to pass it on to, I believe, Ryan.
Thanks so much, Maria Elena, for all your organizing and canvassing in Michigan. Hey, this is Ryan Greenwood, Director of Movement Politics at People's Action. I'm going to close our presentation before we take more questions by laying out some of our concluding thoughts and placing this work inside our full political plan for 2020. So we're clearly in the midst of a COVID-19 pivot. And in scenario planning with our state operations, in the instance that we need to stick with the phones, text, and social media organizing and deep canvas methodology in those scenarios, all the way through the election in November, or scenarios where we get back on the doors in September or July, or points in between. So we think in this moment, in terms of the wider progressive movement, we've done an incredible job of swiftly amassing cutting edge demands in DC and in many state capitals, like the People's Bailout that we're part of that launched yesterday, and many folks on the call were as well as mutual aid efforts. And in addition, we feel like there are some gaps that we're seeing in our collective response, and that where we feel like we can contribute. The first is that this is a massive base building opportunity. Everyone across the country is suffering, physically separated, but joining together by reaching out to family and friends through electronic means. This is an excellent time for organizations to be checking in at a very human level with their entire membership and to a much wider audience. We also have to be making meaning for people. And in a lot of ways, that's happening now within the right-wing infrastructure. Mike, with his weekly summary, and others on the call have well documented the ways in which the right-wing infrastructure has elevated anti-China and anti-Chinese American sentiments throughout this period, and that's the meaning they're defining. Without us defining an alternative meaning, the experience that Maria Elena and others referred to, of the president's approval rating and support continuing to rise, and the right will simply blame China and Chinese people for the crisis. We, as People's Action, think we have just one part of the way to win this. It's going to be a broader movement effort, but deeper engagement of voters through this deep canvas methodology is one key way to do that, and we have multiple positive experiences. We have a path to do this engagement at scale and to impact the key elections this fall in key states. This next slide shows our priority states that are throwing down through deep canvassing, where we're going to concentrate both this deep engagement on the phones, through text exchanges, and on social media and relational organizing. In the program, I'm going to lay out sort of a tier 1 and a tier 2. For the next 2 months, we'll be turning the ignition with our groups as they phone canvass and text bank targeted lists of voters, starting with the smallest concentric circles of their own members and then moving out to the general public. These won't be your typical organizer outreach conversations. Our goal is to really connect with people, see how they're doing in the time of the COVID-19 and associated health and economic crisis, and address their direct needs. That's the calling that's going on right now. In the process of those conversations, by phone and text, we'll engage in meaning making. How did this public health emergency happen? what does it say about the state of our current health system? How do we overcome American, individualism and pull together as a community? And of course, we'll move people to action then, either targeted towards their state elected officials, corporations, or in Washington, D.C. The beauty, by the way, in some of this, for example, text banking, is that it'll begin to help us narrow our real universe of voters, who are the undecided, conflicted, persuadable voters, who will become our real individually targeted persuasion universe. And then in addition, who are the low propensity voters that we've established a relationship with, who we can motivate to vote. We'll need a deeper touch through this methodology throughout the summer and fall. From May to July, we'll build out the structural skeleton for volunteer operations. The final structure we'll use will be a blend of paid and volunteer. But our philosophy is always that if you want a true program to scale, you got to do that with volunteer power. And at the same time, we'll be completing work on the Trump Deep Canvas script to see how it moves as we more explicitly call out Trump with conflicted voters. We have been and will be recruiting staff and volunteers throughout the course of that. And our final Deep Canvas conversations will occur in the fall. And we've got scenario planning to do those on the doors or the phones. The current budget and gap for this project, our organizing for our political plan in general, we're a strong mix across People's Action of urban, suburban, and rural folks. Our political program is thus focused both on infrequent base turnout, that's Latinx people from Aurora, Colorado to Yakima, Washington, Black folks in New York and Vegas, Middle Eastern immigrants in places like Metro Detroit, Asian immigrants and Asian Americans in places like King County and the San Francisco Bay Area. That broader political program budget is around 12 million. We've raised about 5 million, but the specific breakout for the Deep Canvas methodology and the persuasion universe that we're talking about today is about 4 million. And of that, we've raised about 1.8 million. So we got about 2.2 million to raise for this Deep Canvas persuasion project in the targeted states that we flashed up earlier. We have completed the fundraising and there's a lot of generosity. So thanks to folks on the call to implement the next round, the C4 Trump specific persuasion experiment that several folks referenced on the call. Before we open it up for questions on our broader political program or what folks heard overall, I would love to invite Tyler Moran, who's the director and principal at the Immigration Hub, our partner for digital testing in Pennsylvania and Michigan. And she's going to briefly respond to our finding on last fall's Canvas and talk about how they can relate to the digital organizing they're doing at the Immigration Hub. Tyler?
Great, thanks so much, Ryan, and hey everybody, I hope you all are doing well. So we think this is really incredible and important work that People's Action is engaged in, and we're especially excited to have another data point that supports the notion that you can reach and persuade swing and moderate voters on immigration. As Mehrdad noted when he talked, we've done extensive polling and digital testing in swing counties with moderate voters in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Colorado to persuade and inoculate. And we have found that these voters are susceptible to Trump's messaging if it's heard in a vacuum. And this is incredibly dangerous given what George noted at the opening, which is that Trump is using this xenophobic language to reach this particular audience as part of his re-election campaign. But we found that when those same voters hear a contrasting vision, one that focuses on humane solutions to fix the broken immigration system, they side with the progressive viewpoint and they reject Trump's cruel approach. So right now, at least in the digital space as a movement, we are very, very behind. In the last 10 to 11 months, Trump has spent, I think, over $3.2 million on immigration just on Facebook. This doesn't count other platforms. Certainly more than anyone that's run on the Democratic side of the ticket. And last year it was, I think, over 16% of his entire budget. So this isn't to say that Democrats have to make immigration like their #1 issue in the campaign. Obviously, they need to speak to voters about their economic and health concerns. That's critical, but we also can't let Trump's attacks go unanswered. We can sort of walk and chew gum at the same time, because if we don't do that, we're risking voters only hearing one side of the story, and they're getting hit really hard now. And so if candidates don't say something, or if we on the advocacy side don't, Trump is going to fill in the blanks about what the Democratic candidates stand for. This is especially concerning. We did polling before the Democratic primaries debates started last year and again in December, and in both times it found that only 30% of voters know very well what Democrats stand for, but 46% know very well what Republicans stand for. So we've seen from our digital testing that we actually can move swing voters. We worked with SCIU in the 2018 midterms to do a swayable test where we took that sort of xenophobic caravan video against a video that we did with a veteran talking about how Trump's border policies don't represent American values. And the test revealed that the caravan ad backfired. It increased turnout intentions of liberal-leaning and moderate women between 6 and 8% in Pennsylvania, and there was also a net backlash effect in rural audiences in Pennsylvania. In Colorado, in the Kaufman-Crow race, we found that after viewing our video, 35% of independent voters and over 50% of women said they were less likely to vote for Kaufman. So we've been running this digital program for 2 years, and we did an extensive digital audit this year, and we now have really defined benchmarks for each state about how we define success in identifying people. And we currently are working with Civis, and we'll have a voter model for moderate voters. It'll be a model of voters that can be persuaded and a model of voters where we can inoculate. And so we're super excited to combine this model, which we'll have in Pennsylvania, Michigan, but also Wisconsin and Colorado, to combine it with People's Action voter files to identify the people for this combined deep voter engagement and digital targeting. And we're hoping that we're going to be able to impact voter perception of immigration and also move voter choices. So I'm going to stop there. We're just really looking forward to this. We're looking at as a pilot project and a test, and we're hoping to have really concrete data points in the future about what tactics work best, both for future elections, but also for any advocacy campaign. So I'll end there and turn it back to you all.
Great. All right. Jen, I'm going to try and close. Okay, great, perfect. Hey everyone, so there's a slew of questions. We're excited to get to them. I'm just going to close and really try and summarize, which is really just stating our theory, which is in critical states, we can use deep engagement, and you can use that not just for persuasion. I think people just often will only place deep canvassing in the persuasion bucket. We think that it can be a tool and should be a tool for mobilization as well. And part of our theory is also that we can use volunteer operations to do something that I think Ryan described really well that happened in Minnesota, which is doing deep engagement, but also doing it at scale. And we are in this very important moment in which we can be doing massive amounts of base building, but also helping voters, as Tyler, as Ryan, as Shug, as Dom have all really driven home, really make meaning of the moment that we're in. And we're excited to use all of these layered tactics to segment parts of the electorate, again, whether it's mobilization, whether it's a persuadable voter, to really drive home to victory. So that's really trying to kind of state our theory of change in a nutshell. And then we're excited to just get the slew of questions that are in the chat. The first thing that I want to raise, I think it was Felicia from Beacon Fund that asked about what our real gap is. And Felicia, we have for the experiment that I described that goes where we're trying to test this and iterate on this anti-Trump script, we have raised the money for the experiment. We have not raised the money for the scaled program that happens in the fall. Just to be clear about that. There were other questions about effectiveness of paid versus volunteer canvassers. And I think Adam was going to take that and a few others.
Yeah, these are all great questions. Kenny Diggs from Ask put in some great questions. I think we just to clarify, so the cost per conversation, what our projection is would be about $17.80, or between $17.30 and $17.80 to do this kind of a deep canvas program in a scaled fashion. And that's like the cost per conversation, assuming that this is a door-to-door canvas. We just have pivoted everything last week to the phones, so we're running the numbers on what this will look like in a phone program. We think it will be slightly less, but we're still running the math on all of our contact rates, and we're testing a set of assumptions underneath the budget. But we should have the cost per deep canvas conversation via the phones. We should have that cost, by the end of the month. And another great question that Kenny had asked is around, like, if you were to scale this, like, well, what would be the cost of sort of a persuaded voter? So it's a little, it depends on what the topic of persuasion is, and that's why we're running this experiment, the C4 partisan political persuasion experiment. We're going to run that to cost out, like, what will be the actual impact and movement rate, and cost it out, like, what would be the impact for the fall election. But if you were to take, like, our program around, and you were trying to move a huge segment of the voters around this issue of including undocumented immigrants into like a universal healthcare proposal, it would be around $200 per, like, successful persuaded conversation, because you have to have, because it's about an 8% movement rate, you have for every 100 conversations you actually persuade 8 voters. So that would be approximately what it would cost out at. And then I think just one other thing about the question about efficacy of volunteers versus paid staff. We've done experiments in the past with Hari Han, where we've really tried to, like, understand and measure the impact of volunteers versus paid canvassers. And we find that, like, in terms of contact rate, persuasion rate, that volunteers are just as effective in doing this kind of canvassing as paid staff. It's just that they just aren't able to do it with the frequency. But as long as you have volunteers, you have, as Ryan was saying earlier, volunteers, you have a good training program, as Don was saying, you have good support systems in place, and that you're able to retain volunteers and they work multiple shifts, we find that volunteers, if you have those conditions in place, volunteers are just as effective as a paid canvasser in this kind of a program. I think those were the major questions that I was going to answer. Oh, and yeah, and just to restate, Ryan put this in the chat as well. It's about $2.2 million that we're trying to raise for the C4 Deep Canvas program to scale it up this fall. Oh, yeah, yep. And that would be, yeah, the $200 number is for, again, that's just projecting off of a fully paid program. It's an approximate number based on what we're working on. We will follow up, though, to look at, that's from this last program. We will follow up to make sure we can get you a slightly more refined number. Are there other questions? Yeah, I think.
I'll go off the screen share just so we can see participants as well. So folks should continue to put their questions into the chat. And also want to make sure we're getting, I think we've answered the question so far. And if there isn't a way, let's see, So I'm speaking with
Yeah, training.
Yeah. Length of training. Let's see. Ella, do you want to take that?
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, so length of training this a little bit earlier. So we have actually found, we've done randomized controlled trials with David and Josh on a volunteer only program and a paid program. And we have actually found that even first time volunteers with 2 hours of training are just as effective as folks who have been doing this work for a long time. So we have a lot of excitement about scaling with larger volunteer programs that might be at lower cost, but I think we have to do a lot more calculations on that. And in terms of the training, a first time training for someone going out is about 2 hours. And so we train for 2 hours, then we go out in the field for 2.5, and then folks come back and debrief. And we have a longer, more like an hour longer, folks are able to unpack what happened, what went really well, what did they struggle with. So we do a lot of training in the debrief. And then subsequently, whether it's a volunteer program or a paid canvasser program, we work on very specific skills. So first it's foundationally like assertiveness and building your own stories. And then we do more advanced trainings around what does it mean to listen? Like, how do we listen when we're really nervous? How do we listen when we're triggered? How do we stay emotionally safe in a conversation? How do we know when to get out? And then finally, really work on that cone of curiosity. Like, how do we dig out a story and sort of mine the emotion of voters over the long haul? So what we've found is that canvassers really develop, yes, canvassing skills, but like life skills, like as Shug and Maria Elena and Dom spoke about, like you really gain this new sort of set of life experiences to use in the world. And I would say that folks really like to stay and do this work, whether it's a paid canvas team or a volunteer team. We have immense retention because the leadership development and emotional support and community building is such a high priority for us.
Great. Thank you, Ella. Let's see, I want to make sure folks can hear me. All right, great. Thank you, Ella. So if there are no more questions, I'm going to give this maybe 10 seconds to see if there's any last questions in the chat. And just while maybe people are putting in there, yeah, just I want to see if there's any reactions. It may not be a question. It may just be, yeah. What's your reaction to the work, both the scale or the depth, and then I also want to make sure folks know we have. We've summarized the experience that we had from the fall, from the immigration and healthcare canvas, and that should be landing in people's inboxes. It'll actually be a follow-up to this webinar that we'll do, and people should see that in your inboxes by the end of this week. And if there are no additional, oh yes, yeah, and we're getting a suggestion about who to follow up with for any additional questions, and that could just be me, and people will receive the calendar invite via my email for this webinar, and I'll just put my email in case people do not have it. It's just mazamoon@peoplesaction.org, and I'll put it into the chat. And if there are no other reactions, then we will wrap this up. And let me just throw my email into the chat. And thanks very much for joining this morning.